Order. Good afternoon and welcome to the Women and Equalities Select Committee. Today we will be holding a follow-up session on misogyny in music. In our first panel, we'll be hearing from Laura Snapes, Deputy Music Editor at The Guardian. She's on our screens just there. Lucy Cox, freelance soprano singer. Dr. Charisse Beaumont, Chief Executive Officer of Black Lives in Music, and Celeste Waite, singer-songwriter. Thank you very much for all joining us here. We're really grateful to have your experience, your expertise, and also your knowledge. So thank you very much. So I'm going to start off. Charisse and Laura, this committee and our predecessors have found it really difficult getting female artists to speak on record about their experiences in the music industry. Why do you think so few are willing to do so? Lucy, I'll ask you first, if you're happy to.
Yeah. So it's a very small world, and I think that it's been normalised that misogyny and bullying are taking place in the industry all the time. When I first started singing at one of my very early auditions, I was told that I was going to have to wait for somebody to get pregnant or die before I would get any work. And then I was later, I later gave a performance at which a man was attending who was in a position of power. And I was doing a solo and I was really pleased because I thought I might get some work out of it. And he asked me if I'd performed a sex act on the conductor in order to get the solo. So this sort of sets the tone as to what's going on. And I mean, when you're starting out in your 20s, and that's what is normal, it becomes very difficult to challenge it because everybody's laughing about it and you find yourself laughing along, and then you're complicit and suddenly it becomes impossible to speak out.
Lucy, thank you for sharing that, and I'm sorry you experienced that, and I would imagine you're not alone in experiencing that sort of pressure.
No, so I did put a call out to other women working in the classical music industry, mostly singers, and I got a lot of responses, some of which were very familiar to me, echoing my own experiences. So I think that while it's not spoken about a lot, it doesn't mean at all that it isn't happening.
Charisse, is there anything that you wanted to add to that at all? Or is
Yeah, I think what I said to your predecessors, it's when people feel uneasy about speaking out, it's because they have a lot to risk. They have to risk their careers, their reputation, their mortgages on their house. You know, they'll lose gig, they'll lose work, their family in some cases. And why risk something, risk everything for something where you may not be believed? And I think this is the root of what we're saying here in regards to reporting. You know, most of the people that we speak with, we did a piece of research called Your Safety, Your Say, to gather the stories of victims of bullying harassment, and we gathered over 300 stories. And what we found in regards to reporting and speaking about it is that most of the people that we speak with do confide in friends and family. And only a few people, 28% or 29%, actually make an official report. But unfortunately, in many cases, those who have made a report, it negatively impacts their career. And then what's worse, 13% say they see no action. And that kind of lines up with what's in the Musicians' Union's report in regards to bullying and harassment. In most instances, as Lucy shared here, is that the perpetrators are protected. And in many cases, because they're protected, they're able to continue their harmful behaviour. Only a small amount of reports lead to any real action. And people feel when incidences happen, action should be taken.
Thank you. Laura, I'm sure that perhaps people may confide in you as well. And to what extent are sexual harassment and bullying still seen as normalised parts of the working culture in the music industry?
I think that they're entirely normalised, but not necessarily in a way that there's a sort of tacit acceptance that it's just something you do and get away with. I think it's perhaps more endemic to how so much business is done and how relationships are structured. I think often bullying and harassment are happening in isolated situations, like between a musician and a producer or in a backstage area. It's not like something's happening in your office and all of your colleagues witness it. And if someone complains about something that's happened behind closed doors, it can easily be dismissed as a misunderstanding or chalked up to tricky interpersonal relations, or perhaps worse, the artist being difficult and not understanding how things work, which might then create further complications for them. Just going back to the previous question, I think another reason why people don't speak out, especially in the more pop-leaning side of things, is that you might well be tied into a several-album contract with your label. And if you make a fuss now and you still owe them 3 records to come, you don't know what that process is going to be like. You might not get the funding to make the record. You might not get the promotion that you deserve for it either. I think one good example is in 2018, Lily Allen alleged that an executive at her record label had tried to rape her and that she didn't report the attack because she was worried that she would be seen as an unreliable witness. And she said she subsequently turned down an opportunity at BBC Radio 1 because it would have put her in the same room as that man. And she also alleged that the station then punished her for not participating by not giving her next single any airplay. And I think also what outsiders will readily see as bullying or harassment is also the sort of thing that within record labels can be seen as simply doing business effectively. For example, criticising a woman's appearance or instructing her on how to present herself more appealingly, as they may see it, might be viewed within a business as a sort of pragmatic response to what it takes to succeed in the market, rather than coercion and sexual exploitation.
Thank you, Laura. I just wanted to go back to something you just said there about it's how business is done or business as usual. Can you explain a little bit more about that phrase? How is business done or seen to be done in the music industry?
Well, to my last point, I was thinking specifically about image there, where if a young woman is told you need to be sexier because that's what's going to succeed in the marketplace, that's the sort of thing that I meant. And I think also if you think about the relationship between often producers, who are nearly always men, less than 5% of producers in this country are female or non-binary, that relationship is often an experienced man who's got lots of success under his belt being paired with a young woman who might be at the outset of her career. And because he has got a proven success rate, it might be seen that, whatever it takes to get the job done, I think there's a lot of tolerance, especially when it comes to that particular role for, so the cost of business, as it were, to sort of be like, well, that's just how it goes.
Okay, thank you, Laura. I'm going to hand over to Charisse now.
Thank you, Chair. My next question, I think, is for Celeste. In your experience, to what extent does the way in which the music industry works allow powerful men to pressure women not to speak out about their bad behaviour? Is it something that you're aware of? And I think I might know the answer to that. And if so, how does it happen?
Thank you for your question. I think firstly it's important to make the point that I don't think it's necessarily purposefully or intentionally set out in a way that allows people to have this kind of behaviour. Yeah. But what I think it does do is it kind of encourages people who are already having ill intentions, whether that's in their personal life or their professional life, to see a system in which they're able to take advantage of that. And what I do really feel exists within the music industry, and I know there's some topics that you'll go on to speak about, but I feel that what is most prevalent, I think, in the daily experience of being a female in the music industry is this idea of a kind of ingrained bias or even an unconscious sexist bias. And that's comes from the kind of rhetoric or the kind of interactions you might hold with people on a daily basis or on a weekly basis. I think that really depends on your position and your stature as a woman within your industry, on how much you might deal with that kind of behaviour, if you like. Yeah.
Okay, so are you saying that it depends on sort of where you're at in terms of the hierarchy within the industry?
I think that all women will deal with it, and there'll be kind of like a scale almost in which how much you might, and also how much you have an awareness of being able to kind of posture yourself in certain environments to be able to kind of take a bit more of the power share, perhaps, for yourself. So I can imagine what I might experience would be different to perhaps an artist who is, on a global scale. And I know, for example, then from some of my close friends and peers who are just starting out in music and emerging within their careers, experience things that I haven't experienced when I've had the protection of already being established and people already aware that you have a voice to speak about these things. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. And what are some of the more common ways in which this poor behaviour occurs? So do certain settings pose more of a risk. So, for example, areas where there's alcohol and drugs present, and I know, Laura, you alluded to earlier as well, sort of the idea of sort of backstage and how business isn't done in, it's not done in rooms and things like that. You've got very different settings. So are there sort of more common settings that allow for that sort of behaviour to occur?
Yes, I do think the frequency of being in professional environments that are also sociable environments, like gigs.
Yeah.
And there's lots of other elements to it that kind of are those spaces. I do think that people know that it's wrong. They know physical abuse is wrong. They know verbal abuse is wrong. They know that grooming is wrong within those spaces, and we all have an awareness of that in society too. But I think there are other, perhaps quite damaging, perhaps even more so damaging behaviours, maybe psychological abuse that can happen, and certain behaviours and acts that are harder to detect, and they kind of can fall into this grey area at times, especially when perhaps drugs and alcohol are present, and not everybody still engages in alcohol and drugs in the same way that I think people have the impression people did maybe in the 90s or the early 2000s. Like, I don't drink and I don't, do all of that. So, and a lot of my friends don't. But I definitely think, again, those kinds of environments that have grey areas are allowing certain people to take advantage over people that they can see are potentially more vulnerable.
Yeah, thank you so much. Lucy, Charisse, Laura, did you have anything else that you wanted to add to any of those?
I mean, just speaking on the informality of the setup, and I think often you're working with people who are friends, and sometimes it becomes very difficult because you know what people's home lives are like. You know that the person who's done something is married. You can see exactly what kind of impact a report would have on them if it were taken seriously. So that's another thing that makes it very complicated to talk about these things.
Thank you. Please.
In terms of grey areas, I think there's the issue of intersectionality as well. There is a difference in between, let's say, women of colour or people that are disabled get treated other than other people. That needs to be highlighted. I think where you said in regards to settings, though, what we found in our reporting is that a lot of the abuse tends to happen in studios and live settings as well, gigs, concerts, festivals.
Yeah.
A lot of the abuse happens by somebody who's quite close, i.e. a manager or a promoter as well. And there's not really anywhere for people to go or call out. I think one of the aspects of being in that predicament, and what I guess we're trying to drive home today, is where do people go when this happens? What's the end goal in terms of, how is the pathways of people being able to see that these perpetrators are going to be brought to justice? And that is not clearly defined.
Thank you, Charisse. Laura first, and then I'm going to ask everybody else. I have a feeling I know the first half of this question, which is the previous committee heard witnesses say that the music industry had not yet had its Me Too moment. Why do you think that is? Do you think it ever will? And what will it take for that to actually happen in the music industry, Laura?
I think it's important to focus on the fact that within film, Harvey Weinstein's downfall was the result of household name celebrities like Gwyneth Paltrow speaking out against a majorly influential figure, and doing so to publications like the New York Times and the New Yorker, which have got the resources and the legal wherewithal to be able to investigate a story like that. And you cannot underestimate the amount of momentum, both celebrity and journalistic and legal, required to make that kind of impact. And I think there have been big individual cases that have led to prosecution or at least major reputational damage. Look like R. Kelly, Puff Daddy, Tim Westwood. But it's notable in each one of those cases, the allegations had been swarming for years and years before they were properly investigated, which I think is also very easy to link to the fact that the alleged victims were predominantly young black women. And I think you have to think about whose experiences are valued, what the so-called perfect victim looks like, and how that squares against what is likely a very, very low benefit of speaking out in the first place. I also think that to keep thinking about there being some kind of future moment, as it were, is a bit distorting and distracting. I think this is in film again, but you only have to look at the Blake Lively case in the US, as well as the sort of mainstreaming of misogynist views generally, to see the backlash to the Me Too movement and to the idea that alleged abusers should face consequences for wrongdoing, both within the entertainment industry and among sectors of the public. I don't think we're going to get a moment in music, and I don't think we should be waiting one either. I think it's a little bit passive and maybe limited to perceive the problem as something that one day might explode, rather than as a sort of ongoing process of ensuring safety and respect, as well as appropriate consequences and justice for wrongdoing, which we could act on now. I can say how I think we might do that, but
okay. I would actually, because I do think I agree with you that the Me Too moment and the movement in terms of the film industry actually it lifted the lid about things that everybody already knew about. And in terms of justice, yes, there have been some perpetrators that have received justice, but I'm sure that there are many others that have just gone under the radar and continue to go under the radar, and it hasn't solved the problem of the structural inequalities that are within these industries. So what would it take for, do you think, us to see more prosecutions of perpetrators, and more safe spaces and support for people that are actually coming out against this kind of behaviour?
Well, I suppose prosecution is perhaps more of an issue for the Justice Department. I would say that, coming back to your very first question, probably one of the things that prevents women from speaking out is that I think you're probably more likely to get sued for defamation for doing so than to achieve any sort of successful prosecution for the person you're speaking out against. But in terms of, creating a culture of safety, these are just some ideas, but I think record labels should create codes of conduct to be signed by all parties on a project. HR departments need to be robust and ideally outsource difficult situations to independent bodies, because I think we all know that HR departments tend to act in the interest of the business. Labels need to prioritise equality at all levels of business, from the boardroom down to producers, who, as I said, remain largely male, a role ripe for perpetuating abuse. I think recording sessions should always be recorded, just in case recourse to footage is required over any alleged incidents within the studio. Section 14 of the Equality Act should be brought into force, and the government should accept the recommendations of last year's report. But I think, moreover, looking beyond music, the government rejected the recommendations last year and pointed to the Equality Act and existing requirements and protections for any employers. But the reason these clearly aren't effective requires looking beyond music. Misogyny is more of a societal plague than I can ever remember it being in my lifetime. And I think robust education for young people and young men on equality, respect, consent, and debunking so-called gender norms about who's best suited to what kind of job is what has to happen in schools as a matter of urgency, or nothing will ever, ever change.
Thank you. Does any of the other panellists want to add to that at all? Or has Scott?
I mean, without the need for a Me Too movement, I think there are known perpetrators in the classical music industry who everybody knows that it's happening. And I mean, I had a woman write in describing an experience. I don't work with this woman, she's not a singer, but I was able to exactly pinpoint who she was talking about because she'd done exactly the same thing to me. And so if there, at the moment there is no incentive for these people not to behave like that, nobody's holding them to account, there's no way of getting justice. As you say, you risk being sued if you start speaking out about people, and it's very difficult to know how to avoid these situations and how to educate. So I think education is an excellent idea, because these people don't know how to behave. They have no idea.
Is it that they don't know how to behave, or they know that behaviour is wrong and they still get away? They know they're going to get away with it.
Absolutely, I think they're being enabled in so many different ways. I think there's structural facilitation. If you think about, and I agree with everything that Laura says, she's literally just taken all of my notes in one go. And but if you look at, let's say, the Cassie Ventura case against Sean Diddy Combs, it took for us to see a video to believe her. When I think people need to be believed immediately. That was her words. They should have believed me the first time around. We have thousands of women. You've got this panel. You've had loads of panels over the last year, thousands of pieces of evidence, women saying this is happening, being reported, by the way, yet we're not believed. And I think the general sentiment for people that are in the industry who are reporting is there's a frustration that We spoke, and not enough is being done about bullying and harassment. All we have are these reports, and to many, like you said, Lucy, to many, the most common outcome is there's no action or personal penalties at worst, like you said. So people are risking and taking a risk, and nothing's being done.
What would justice look like in that setup that you had just explained, Lucy, to the person that is a perpetrator that has repeatedly behaved in that way? What would justice look like to you?
I don't think they should be able to continue being in that position of authority and power. If they've proven again and again that they can't be trusted and that they take advantage of situations that are to the detriment of the whole industry and to the women who are suffering these experiences, then they shouldn't be allowed to continue to work in that sector.
Thank you. Rachel.
Thank you, and thank you all of you for speaking up and for speaking out. It really is so important. And with that in mind, I'd like to ask Laura first. Without giving any identifying details, are you aware of anyone in the music industry that's been pressured into signing a non-disclosure or NDA agreement to prevent them talking about their experience of sexual misconduct or discrimination?
Yes, I'm aware of several people who have signed NDAs to that nature.
Several have signed them. Are you aware of that being a more widespread sort of ask? Has everybody that you're aware has been asked to sign them? Have they all signed them, or have some refused?
I can't speak to the specificities of it, but I know that they are used in a very widespread way.
Okay, thank you. Charisse, have you got anything to add to that?
In accordance to our research, and I think this is a low number in regards to the fact we're talking about NDAs, but 24% of the people that we spoke to said they've been pressured to sign an NDA. So if you're talking about, if it was reflective across the music industry, you're talking about a quarter of the music industry. And I think that's being conservative, if I'll be honest.
Yeah.
Charisse, the government's considering banning the use of NDAs in circumstances involving harassment and abuse. Is that something you think people working in the music industry would support?
Absolutely. I think, NDAs are complicated, but I think in the, where you're cloaking crime, it's a crime. I think NDA shouldn't be used. They're being misused to protect perpetrators. It's become a distrusted weapon and has negative impacts, particularly when misused to suppress and shield misconduct and exploit power imbalances. NDAs ethically depend on the context and how they're implemented, but right now it allows the powerful people to bully, to stifle and block the truth from being known. And we need to look at all structures around abusers and give them no place to hide.
Thank you. Lucy or Celeste, is there anything you want to add to that? You can easily say no.
I don't think so, no.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Yeah, I just agree that I think it's very important, actually, that it can't be used to silence people when they've experienced some of the things that we've mentioned. But I think something that's important to add to that is some powerful individuals that have the confidence to know that they could potentially stifle you even without having you signed an NDA. They will exercise the use of the power that they hold in whatever way that they can. So, but I do think it will help a lot to be able to do that.
Thank you. Laura, did you want to come back on that?
No, only to add that I think it would be very helpful to ban them.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rachel. Rosie.
Yeah. In your experience, how much control do women in the music industry have over their appearance, image, and how they're marketed compared to men? And I'd be interested to hear from Celeste and Lucy particularly on that.
Let's start?
Okay, yeah. I think perhaps for myself, my experience in how much control I have over my image is different to other people, because actually the way that I dress and costume for my performances is very much a part of my expression. There is also an element to that, which is that has been a really lucrative part of my career, is fashion, and I've always taken the lead on that. So perhaps that's also where I have a freedom with it, because people can see it works for me in that way. But I do know that other people's experiences are a lot different, where I've heard of girls being told either to cover up because they don't look sophisticated enough if, you know, parts of their body are showing. And then I've heard it on the other hand, where people are given certain items of clothing by a stylist that's somewhat under the influence of people in a position of power around them, or perhaps people that may be funding some of that public appearance, and they're not feeling very comfortable or content with the options that they're given because they feel maybe it's showing their body in a way they don't feel comfortable with. So I've understood that to be the experience of other women within my industry, although it hasn't been my own.
Thank you. Lucy, would you say it's similar in the classic industry?
I think it's similar and different. I think the women certainly have much more prescriptive dress codes than men when you're doing big projects with lots of participants. The word sexy probably wouldn't appear on a schedule, but I have worked for choirs where they specify that they prefer us to have a V-neck, which I find odd. And the thing about being asked to cover up, actually, I mean, not being allowed to have bare shoulders is something that comes up. I've also been asked by a man not to cross my legs, which, again, is not acceptable, is it?
Thank you for being so honest. Dr. Beaumont, you've previously published data showing that 70% of black women have felt the need to change something about themselves to be accepted in the industry, like lightening their skin. Do these pressures still exist today? And if so, can you explain why and how they can be tackled?
Yeah, I'm going to speak to the image aspect of it, because I feel like black women in music in particular are over-sexualised. So when we look at the data, it said 42% of women, all women, felt pressure to change their appearance to become more sexual. 25% were more encouraged to act and dress in ways that were overly sexualised. Some of the quotes we got from all women, I've been told in order to be successful, I must make the men in power think I want them. I feel like if I have to sell records, I need to be talking about sex. Sex sells. Making you feel like money is more valuable than art, to dress different, to talk different and become more acceptable. However, when we speak to the black women in our community, many of the women that we survey and speak with believe as a community we are being sexualised, black women are being sexualised and being made objectified. The industry chooses to put most of its money into rappers and singers who feel they can portray an image that will bring down the black community. These artists' lyrics are hypersexual. I feel like black creators are more supported if they push a self-destructive narrative. For example, black female artists, rappers in particular, speak more about overtly sexual topics and carrying themselves in the manner that brings them down. I wish that the music industry was not all about the visual aspect. At the moment, it's about music videos, the sexual abusive behaviour, and how sexy you are, rather than the music. Laura said earlier on how the music industry can, or she spoke about education, young children, young people, educating them about bullying, harassment, and how to treat women. If people on their mobile phones, kids on their mobile phones, are constantly bombarded with sexual images of black women looking this way, what do you think is going to happen? Our data, the Musicians Union data, the Musicians Union census, and Help Musicians data says black women are the most are bullied and sexually harassed more than any other people group. So there's a correlation. We're seeing something here. And that's why something needs to be done. However, we're also the most likely to be unbelieved, not believed, as well at the same time. So it's important that there's a place for women to go to, and that's where we believe the Creative Industries Independent Standards Authority will be an independent place, a safe space for black women and black people to fight against discrimination.
I'm just going to ask. So Charisse has talked about that intersectionality there that black women face. Celeste, as a biracial woman in the industry, how does this affect you specifically?
Yeah, okay. I suppose where I would start is more with my observation. So, yeah, I'm biracial, I'm Jamaican and British. And so I suppose I do take note of these kinds of experiences that are playing out. And I acknowledge too that my experience is potentially different to a woman that's a dark-skinned black woman, or a woman that, for example, has grown up in a different cultural setting. For myself, I've grown up in a white working class culture, and then where I then later received my education, I suppose you could say more of a white middle class culture. So that kind of allows me certain touch points with certain people within my industry where we can relate to one another. Whereas I can recognise for some of my friends and for some of the female musicians that have grown up in slightly different circumstances, which perhaps some individuals in the music industry are more removed from, and perhaps have had less exposure, if that's the correct sort of terminology for it, or friendships or experiences with people from diverse ethnic minority background, ethnic backgrounds. And so what I feel I have seen is that I do feel like there is a portrayal of black women in the mainstream that is overtly sexualized. And I do feel that there perhaps is a pattern where you're seeing the women that are perhaps getting the support and then are also able to kind of then reach these kind of like this grand scale are the ones that take on this certain image. And I do think that there is a toxic expectation around black women's bodies, which over time has kind of progressed into women having to take potentially dangerous and invasive surgical procedures or extreme beauty trends to achieve this image. And then perhaps also what I can imagine is what seeps in is this idea that you have ambition and there's something that you want, but you are not able to reach it unless you kind of take on some of this form that you're seeing so commonly. I think what it also is linked to is the fact that there's always a pressure for artists to kind of like take on or conform to some ideas of what is within the mainstream, because at some stage there's always somebody that's kind of like a trailblazer, which breaks kind of like an idea of what we see as what is working on a commercial scale. And then they kind of set the parameters maybe for, it could be 5 years, it could be 10 years, it could be a couple of years, until the next person comes along who has perhaps had the fortune and certain and specific advantages that allow them to be able to move through and navigate to be able to get to that top position and make certain choices that their predecessors perhaps didn't have the choice to make, I suppose. I think in regard to myself, I've always kind of taken a decision that if I'm to show my body in a way which feels sexualized, that it is my choice. And I do feel I have been affected by social media actually within this, and I do think this has kind of affected my view and my gaze over myself of perhaps how I should dress. But I don't actually know within my own case whether that's encouraged by my peers or whether that is encouraged by even my fan base. I don't see more reaction in my fan base if I show more skin. I actually get less. So I think it kind of, it's really dependent on the individual, but I would say generally I do see and feel that black women are in a position where there are expectations that are permeating of their expression past just their physical appearance. And I do think it's limiting what black artists feel they can do. And I think that's a shame, because it's a voice that's very important in our society.
I just you said something that's really important. You know, in regards to your fan base and what they want and what you expect, and if you changing yourself, being not authentic, and you know, you losing some of your fan base. In music, people generally like what they like, but the higher ups, what we're talking about here, the actual industry, pump, manufacture stuff, content. And it's unfortunately women and people are being hurt in regards to this. So I think it's really important that we celebrate, but also encourage that there are artists out there that are genuine, that aren't wanting to strip down to nothing and actually become great artists and contribute to the industry. But what the industry invests in are artists or black women that they can over-sexualise. And that's why we see so much of it.
So one of the, I guess, international examples of that really manufactured, and they don't hide it, it's almost like they're proud about it, that K-pop industry, they will sexualise or diminish, or you have to be diminutive and strike that balance between wearing a little bit of clothes but not too little clothes, not being too sexualised but not being plain and boring enough, and the surgical procedures. They're really open about it. Is this what's happening with black women in the UK music industry, but they're just not open about it?
I would say, I'm thinking social media here plays a huge part, you know, and it's almost like a chicken and egg effect where women are being encouraged, as we look into our data, to have certain procedures done because that's what's the norm. But actually, when I think about it, before everybody started to have cosmetic surgeries, BBLs and everything else, we were seeing certain megastars, I won't mention them because I do respect them, but certain megastars having them first. So when we saw those megastars and we were like puzzled as why do they look this way? Why do they look like Barbie dolls as black female artists? Bleached skin, massive bums, massive chests. And now we're seeing how that's impacting society. And we're seeing young girls being pressured, regardless of their background, to do that stuff. I feel that's how powerful and impactful that this music industry is. And that's why we need to uncover it and clean it out, make some real good changes.
Thank you. Rosie, did you want to go back to that?
Yeah, thank you. Dr. Beaumont, I've seen that you've done a lot of work on disability and you touched on it earlier. How do you think that those other protected characteristics, such as race and disability, interact with the sexist discrimination in the music industry?
They interact really badly. According to the musicians' census, musicians' union census, help musicians census, 23% of disabled musicians have been sexually harassed. Let that one sink in. 23%. In 29% of all LGBTQ plus respondents have experienced sexual harassment, and 24% of trans respondents have also been sexually harassed. This impacts their ability to work and their career progression. In our data, the numbers were slightly lower. However, when we're talking about mental health, 74% of LGBTQI artists sought counselling because of how they're being treated in the music industry. 74%. And 69% of those with disabilities also sought counselling to try and protect their mental health. It's not a nice industry to be in if you're not a white male. Sorry to say it like that. That's one of the comments. I didn't say that. That's one of our comments that's coming from our report. It's not a nice industry to be in if you are not a white male. So it does interact really badly when it comes to other protective characteristics.
Okay, does anyone else want to jump in on that one? Laura?
I wasn't going to speak specifically to that, but I just wanted to come back to the image question just for a second. I agree with everything that everybody said, but I think women in music who have power have control over their image. So if you look at somebody, like Taylor Swift or Sabrina Carpenter or Rihanna, and I also think that it is very possible and realistic that a woman with power over her image may also choose to present herself in a sexualized way, and that's on her terms. And it doesn't have to be necessarily a negative thing. I think it's important for women to be able to embody their sexuality. Charisse made the very good point about how influential the music industry is. I can speak for myself and say that I have taken positive influence from musicians I admire talking about those issues or presenting themselves in ways that I hadn't necessarily thought were available to me. So I think there's a lot of positive influence to be had here as well. I think it's just, I don't think we should necessarily consider a sexualized image necessarily bad, as long as the person portraying it has control over it, as opposed to it being handed down to them by a record label or management or so on. And I think there was also one really good example worth citing recently related to all this. Mabel, the 28-year-old British pop star who's had 5 top 10 UK singles, recently talked about the lack of autonomy that she's felt. She's a young mixed-race woman. She's Nana Cherry's daughter. And she said, particularly as a young woman, it's so easy to get moulded into something which is usually based on what another female pop actor's done. Like, this person's done this, so this is what you should do. She said, the reason why I've been making music that a lot of people say has been heard before is because I've got 5 million different people's opinions getting in the way constantly. How am I meant to be making something groundbreaking, different and authentic when there's so many cooks in the kitchen? Exactly what Charisse was saying about authenticity and people who've got something to offer that are not necessarily being allowed to work in the conditions that would let them offer it.
Thank you.
This one's directly to Celeste. What are the everyday ways in which women working in the industry experience prejudice? That might be a really hard one to answer.
It is quite a hard question to answer. In my head, I still had swirling some stuff around based on the last point, and it might end up feeding into this. But I suppose there is this kind of reality within the framework, which is music is something for the soul and from the soul. And it's something that's been made into a huge global business, and it's been industrialized, if you like, over a 100-year period. And there are some sort of systemic behaviors and traits that kind of originated and started in the time where women's position in society was different to what it is now. So I do think there's some part of it which is some of these tropes, if you like, have kind of been passed down, and that's a little bit of what still remains. And then there's obviously then the more harmful and abusive behaviours, which we always know are categorically wrong. I think the kinds of prejudices that you can face on a daily basis within the music industry are people perhaps second-guessing your ideas, feeling that you have realised that you have said the same thing maybe 5 times over 5 or 6 different meetings, and quite often you experience a lot of comparison to other female artists that perhaps there is no real reason for comparison based on your expression or your style of music or your style of writing. The comparison is made purely on a visual basis alone. So for myself, I'll quite often hear comparison with other biracial female artists around my age. And I think that kind of encourages a culture of women not really speaking to women within the music industry, which is such a shame. And I think that we need to be able to feel that we can speak to one another so that we can also act in protecting one another. And I guess if I was going to say one thing today is that is something that I would like to be a change, that is something that we can actually take control of ourselves, is kind of break down these barriers that are set in kind of a competitive environment. And we are all competitive. I'm very competitive in my career, but I don't really seek to compete with specific other and individual women. If anything, I actually want to uplift them, but I always feel like there's this kind of barrier in front where you'll just have this feeling sometimes that somebody holds or harbours a negative feeling or thought towards you, and you've never even spoken to them in your life, kind of thing, and you've never met in person, and that's definitely coming from somewhere that I think it's not just down to men alone. It's a culture within the industry that I'm sure male artists experience too. But I do think that, of course, as we know, sort of the majority of people working within our industry are men, so they do hold a vital kind of responsibility and a weight in making changes and being a part of the success of women within this industry, and women feeling understood and women feeling heard. So, yeah.
Thank you. That probably leads us on to your last question nicely.
Sorry,
that's okay.
Totally engrossed in that, actually. To what extent, sorry, this is for Dr. Beaumont, but anyone who wants to contribute, really, to what extent do you think that misogyny in music can be reduced by having more women, including women of colour, in senior leadership roles?
I think it can be tackled, absolutely. I mean, you know, the organisation I work for, Black Lives in Music, we have 110 industry partners, organisational partners, and it's the ones that have women at the helm that we see do the deep-rooted work. So they're the ones that are diversifying the makeup of the organisations. They're the ones that are taking EDI seriously. They're the ones that are creating pathways for people to come through, particularly women to come through. They're the ones who take, you know, they took this inquiry very seriously, and where they could, implemented the recommendations, you know, independently. The UK music data says that, you know, women at senior management level in the music industry is actually nearly 50-50. It's at 48.3%. So I'll let you think about what that actually means and what you may have seen in the past. Unfortunately, you mentioned black women. That can't be said of black women at all. There are very few senior leaders. There are some, I know them, and they're great. They're watching me now if they are, sorry. They are amazing, and they do great work. But I think in terms of where black women receive misogyny, if we did have more black women at senior management level, that would help. Black women are the most disadvantaged in the music industry. They're paid the least. They're paid 52% less than white men, 17% less than black men, 25% less than white women. They experience racism at a rate of 89%. We've spoke about bullying and harassment. Our data says that black women, unfortunately, have seen 41% of black women working in the music industry have seen their mental health decline. So it is really hard. Black women are also the first to lose their jobs, if you let me just ride this home. You know, I won't say the date, this early last year. In one night, in a 36-hour period, my phone rang, or I got a message sent from black women who are directors across the music industry. All of them lost their jobs. They were the first to go when it was time for the industries to do cuts, both here and in America. Mm-hmm. They are the least valued in the music industry. So where I do see, you know, change in regards to women in leadership roles, I'm seeing them build up the pipeline. I'm seeing them really build women and build them up and really take EDI seriously. I don't see the same thing with black women. UK Music have a 10-point plan, which helps diversify the music industry. The majority of the music industry is signed up to that. As Black Lives in Music, we have an application called Equitrack, which empowers organisations to combat discrimination and safeguard all people from all protected characteristics in the music industry. But I want to land this one home. I said that the industry is at 50%. I have had women who are at senior management level approach me and say, I'm being sexually abused. and they're at senior management level. I want that to say that just because they are at a high level, it doesn't mean that they're exempt. They still need protections, and that's where I think CISA can come in.
On that, in terms of them being at the same level, are they still being paid less? Do you know?
Actually, in regards to senior management level, I don't know how much the gender pay gap. I don't have that information on it. For black people, I could tell you, but that information is readily available from amazing organisations such as PRS for Music. At the helm, a woman at the helm publishes the pay gap, ethnic pay gap reports. The Ivers Academy also do so, and other organisations. I think Sony also do it. Not all of the industry, may I add, but some large corporations in the industry do publish their pay gap reporting. I don't have that information at hand, though.
Thank you. Alex.
Thank you. Lucy, I'm going to ask you first, and just for the record, declare that we are distantly related. Could you tell me how well supported women are in the industry around maternity and around returning to work after having a child?
Yes, so I've got a 6-month-old baby, so I've got a few things to say about this. So I mentioned earlier on that in this very first audition that I did, I was told that I would need to wait for somebody to become pregnant or die in order to start getting any work as a classical singer. So I had a recent conversation with somebody who provides lots of my work, who was telling me what a shame he thought it was that women didn't stay in the industry if they took a gap of a year or two to have children, and he advised me to take on as much as I could. And obviously, all of these things lead to you feeling that you've ended your job by having a child. And for lots of women, that actually is the case for lots of different reasons. I mean, singing in particular, obviously you're using your body. I think this goes for lots of instrumentalists as well. Lots of the parts of your body that change when you're pregnant and have had a baby are very important in doing a good job. So having ample recovery time is actually really important for your long-term health as well. But there's a cognitive dissonance there because you also need to get back to work as soon as possible in order not to fall off these people's lists. And in order to be seen, you also want to recover as quickly as possible. I would say that the maternity allowance for self-employed people is inadequate, especially given the cost of living crisis. There was no way that I could have survived on that. I ended up working until I was about 37 weeks pregnant. I think was my last big solo concert, and then back to work when she was 8 weeks old. I mean, that was my decision. I could have obviously juggled things around a bit, but not everybody has that choice. I mean, apart from anything else, I was very lucky that my injuries after birth weren't so extreme that I wasn't able to do it. But you're constantly trying to balance this new responsibility of having a baby with needing to earn and not wanting to give up on the career that we're all doing because we love.
Thank you.
Yes. Everything she said actually correlates. Thanks for sharing that, because everything that she said actually correlates to some of the data that's out there. You know, there are 9 out of 10 classical musicians turning down work because of parent and carer responsibilities. Self-employed mothers and female carers in classical music experience an £8,000 pay penalty. Only 4% of people working in classical music referenced a supportive employer, and 40% of women working in classical music or parents working in classical music are thinking about leaving their careers. This is from the Bittersweet Symphony report from parents and carers in performing arts who do this work, particularly in classical music, urging government and urging industry to provide care for classical music musicians and improve them working conditions. So I just wanted to put some stats because that is exactly the experience that others are feeling.
Thank you. I just want to follow up quickly on that, the language around someone has to be pregnant or die.
Yeah.
Like the finality of that. How much did that comparison of sort of the end of a career, right? How much did that weigh on you in terms of allow you to feel pressured in coming back to those early concerts soon after your baby was born?
Well, you can see that it stayed with me because it was a long time ago that person said that to me. They're still somebody that I work for, and they might be clever enough not to say those things now, but I'm sure that they still hold those views. So yes, it has a huge impact. I think there's a lot of things that aren't spoken about in relation to hormones, in relation to periods, and how that can affect your singing, and how that can affect your ability to perform on other instruments. Menopause isn't really spoken about. That can affect the voice. And I think this probably also relates to an ageism conversation. I've had reports from women who've contacted me to say that they've been told that they won't be auditioned because the male person that they're asking to be heard by won't hear women over 40. So I think, our bodies are different to men's bodies when as hormones go, and I think there's a vulnerability there. If we take a sick day, we miss a gig, we don't get paid. Somebody else comes along and does that work, and quite often will take over from you entirely. And there's no incentive for the people who are employing us to be sympathetic or to book us again. So what happens is that women end up coming back to work far too soon after having children. They end up pushing through horrible period pains or feeling ill because they're going through the menopause or for any other sorts of reasons, even other illnesses, and there's no recourse for them.
Thank you. So to everyone on this, so whoever would like to go first, this might be a really long list. What steps could be taken to improve support for mothers in the music sector? Obviously, the classical from your experience, Lucy, but the other sectors as well.
I mentioned maternity allowance, not providing enough money to cover most people's basic living costs now. In my case, if my husband had been able to claim more paternity leave, we would have been in a much better position, because then we would have had a second income stream that was more guaranteed. I know that employers are supposed to provide a room for women to breastfeed or to express milk, and also to provide a fridge. I've been on tours since having the baby. It's not possible, or it isn't prioritised perhaps, but it hasn't been the case in almost any of the work that I've done since having the baby, that I've been able to have private space, and I've had to throw away lots of milk, which is not as it should be.
I just wanted to say that in classical music it is tricky just to hear that, but in larger organisations such as the PRS Music again and Sony, they have schemes for working mothers. So I wouldn't say it's an improvement, but some organisations are taking initiative in regards to making changes.
I suppose I have something to say on this. Yeah, but obviously you have the experience of being a recent mother. But I suppose from my perspective, I'm actually 30. So I suppose at this point in your life, you do begin to think about whether that's something that you want to do. And I think that perhaps what happens within our industry is you kind of work and work and work to meet like the highest level of your expectation or your ambition for where you want your career to reach, and there's no measure of time that's there in writing for you over how long that will really take. So it's kind of up to you in a way how much you want to keep pursuing to reach what you feel you deserve. And I was actually lucky enough recently to have a conversation with my managers, and it's important to mention that I have a male manager, but then I also have 2 female managers working on my team, and we actually spoke about is that something that I want to do, and even if that's in 5 years from now or 10 years from now, if it's possible, setting things up in a way in which I am able to do that. But not everybody is actually having the support in their surroundings to have those conversations and to plan financially towards that goal, because, you know, as a independent artist or as a signed artist to a major label or an independent label, really it's your responsibility to earn your own money and perhaps put aside a fund for yourself to be able to take that time off. And some people are working towards an annual salary within what they do, but that can only perhaps be achieved if they perform at festivals every summer or they release an album every year. And if you don't necessarily earn enough to give yourself that security for the duration of the time that you'd like to take off, you actually won't have any financial security. And so then it does kind of, the question bears a certain weight when you're asking yourself if that's something that you want to create an opportunity for within your life. And obviously there's other factors that have to come in for that to be possible, but also not necessarily. I do know lots of women that are perhaps in a position where they can afford to take certain routes which doesn't require for them to meet somebody and be impregnated by somebody that they're in a relationship with, and that's definitely something that I think about as, if you like, a business woman. And you definitely have to come to terms with the fact that that might have to be a route that you take, and it might be the decision that you decide to make for yourself later on. And then it's you factor in what support you can sort of create around yourself to be able to do that. But I'd say if you haven't been in a fortunate enough position to raise the money yourself and earn the money yourself and then save it, it doesn't necessarily allow you the freedom to do that without it posing the question of, are you walking away from your career? Like you mentioned, that's a huge fear. And the fear comes from, I think, the fact that within my kind of area is that the music industry is so fast-paced, and there is kind of, you know, a select few people, and I've been myself within that, lucky enough to get that support from the machine, if you like, and the industry that is this industrialised mechanical kind of operation that I kind of mentioned earlier. And you know, things are budgeted annually. There's only a certain amount of budget assigned to a certain amount of people every year. And if you're going to be seen to not be able to promote your album over a 2-year period, that budget is going to probably, I'm not 100% sure, but there's a chance that it might get assigned to somebody else, and they have to prioritise for who and which certain budgets go to, you know. And there's different reasons why you might get budgeting than others, you know.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
But very quickly, Laura, did you have anything else to add on that from your conversations with musicians?
Just very briefly, the one thing I would say, coming back to how we were talking about image earlier, is that very often after a female musician, particularly a pop star, has a baby, you know, we were talking about sexualization. Suddenly they'll be seen as, you know, DOA. Nobody could possibly be interested anymore because a woman who has a baby is deeply undesirable, as it were. And, you know, it's perceived that being a pop star is all about the appearance of being available and desirable to other people. And I forget the exact title of it, but Paloma Faith made a very, very persuasive documentary about this happening to her a few years ago that I'd really recommend anybody watching. And again, it comes down to how much power you have. You know, Beyonce has a number of children and she can present that as part of her overall artistic package, and nobody's taking that away from her. But I think the lower you go down the sort of like power scale within the industry, the more I think many women would find, particularly in the pop area, that they're sort of cast aside when they go through that process.
Thank you, Alex. I just wanted to ask a quick question before we come to Christine's section of questions. There's a lot of logistics after having a child, and I can imagine that in industries such as the music industry, where you don't have normal working hours between 9 to 5, and that Saturdays and Sundays are also there, childcare. Mm-hmm. Yeah. How is this managed? Is it talked about? Are there any of the industry? Is any part of the industry being supportive of that at all, Charisse?
To me, I'll be honest, I've not heard, I'm hoping maybe the next panel can answer that, but I've not heard of anything positive in regards to childcare. Obviously, we've got parents and what they call pregnant and screwed. Yeah. They worked alongside certain organisations within the music industry to lobby government for childcare. That's about as far as I've heard in regards to the music industry being involved in that.
Lucy, what's your...
Yeah, it's a real worry.
Yeah.
So a lot of my life before having the baby was going on longer tours. It's not financially viable to take her because it involves taking her and another caring adult. So it means my husband can't work, and we're looking at paying for flights and accommodation for him as well, let alone the practicalities of it. So that's a whole load of work that's become sort of unavailable to me. But there's also, as I mentioned, an enormous pressure to keep on trying to make these tours work. So I am, in the future, carting the baby off to Europe on various different occasions, thinking of making a loss. But it's something that I feel I have to do in order to maintain my foothold, because, as we've said, if you don't do the work, then somebody else might well do it, and then you might not get invited back. So it's a huge challenge. And in terms of concerts in the UK or concerts that are closer to home, I mean, at the moment, we're looking at only one of us can work at a time. If I'm not doing it, then my husband is also a singer. So we have to make a choice about who's going to take each job as it comes. But I'm not getting the same invitations to do big tours as I had before I got pregnant. I had a little look at my tax return for 23-24 just before this session, and an employer that gave me 30% of my income last year hasn't invited me to take part in a concert since I told them that I was pregnant. And they're allowed. There's nothing to stop that from happening. And they would say it's coincidence. And only 4% of my work, by the way, was booked by women. So I wonder if the classical music industry is behind the rest of the industry in terms of equality in positions of power. But yes, it's a challenge working out how to readjust my career in a way that fits with looking after her.
Thank you, Lucy. Christine.
Thank you very much, first of all, to all three of you for four of you, I do beg your pardon, Laura, for coming and speaking to us today and being so open about the challenges that you face. And I wonder if we can ask to Lucy, first of all, the Musicians' Union and others have described a lack of facilities and structural support for women working and performing at live music events. Is that something you recognise? And if so, is the situation improving in any way?
Thank you. Well, I think it's a real challenge in classical music because a lot of the venues that we perform in are very old. So we find ourselves in lots of churches and cathedrals. Sometimes on a recent tour that I did just before Christmas, we were working in venues where there were renovations happening, so the usual facilities weren't available. But even when they are, we're often thrown into dressing rooms that are very cramped. Sometimes there isn't a separate dressing room for the women. Sometimes you're just getting changed in a church vestry, so it's not glamorous, and often you have to leave the building to use loos when you're working in churches. So that's a real challenge, and I think not just in the music industry, but over the whole country, I've struggled with changing facilities and having to change the baby on the floor of public loos and things like this. But that's a real problem when you're out working. You've dragged her along with you and you're not at home. So from the perspective of having a child with you, I think there's a lot that could be improved.
As a journalist, I remember interviewing a popular music artist, a very well-known artist in a theatre, and being absolutely astonished at the lack of facilities and how bad the facilities are there. So is this something you have all experienced in your careers, the lack of facilities and structural support for women?
I think it isn't as glamorous as people think it is. It definitely isn't. I would say that it just varies across all the different venues, and when you're touring, you definitely see all kinds of different, rooms. And I feel for me, because I'm a single woman and I tour with my band, I'm quite open with them. And so for me personally, it's like not distressing, and it's just, I just take it, you know, as it comes, and sometimes have really nice places and sometimes not so nice places. But if this is somewhat in relation to the conversation around asking music venues and certain spaces that host, you know, activities related to a career in music and improving their facilities or their staff when it comes to sexual assault or the safety of women, I do think it's important to mention that if a law is passed to kind of imply or suggest or really put into practice that venues that are expected to improve do not receive then funding until they make those improvements. I think it's really important that smaller, more grassroots venues are protected within this decision, because there are some venues that have charm, and you know, it's really important as well that we keep venues for 100 people, 200 people, 300 people, because especially people progressing in their career, you need to be able to have that first gig where you play to even less than 100 people to get to the gig where you can play in front of 10,000 people. So if this piece of legislation would affect those venues, I think it's really important that they have some financial support in doing so. Otherwise, you might see that, you know, some venues in central London may be able to survive because they have a regular kind of clientele, but then smaller venues like around regional towns and things, they may not survive. And we like playing those shows, you know, and it gives you a chance to offer something to people that is a memorable and intimate experience when it comes to the live performance. But I do think when it comes to protecting women against any form of physical violence within these spaces, I do think that we need to have, you know, more personnel that are there and educated in how to spot these sorts of behaviours. And I do think that women need to feel safe in being able to share their experience. I think something that I experienced completely separate and outside of the music industry, I wanted to report something so that it didn't happen to other women, but I was really afraid to report it in case it wasn't dealt with a level of severity that was due, and then I could experience some behaviours from this person who I could already deem to be a danger to my life, that then they could come after me. And I feel that a lot of women within the music industry that experience these kinds of things are very afraid, and they're not necessarily protected. Once they bring something to people's awareness, they do not have the trust that it will be dealt with appropriately. You know, like some people have experienced reporting something and then the person being called who is the perpetrator of the act and immediately mentioning their name. So then where does that really leave you? So I can understand what it's like to be in that position from something I've experienced outside of the music industry, and I know that it's something that women within our industry face and experience when they are met with certain forms of abuse.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. I wonder if I could also ask, maybe to Laura first, what do you think, to what extent do you think the sort of working conditions, etc., that we're talking about for female artists are a factor in the lower representation on live music event lineups?
I don't know that I would necessarily make that correlation, but I think that one thing that's important to highlight here when it comes to the infrastructure of music venues, not just talking about the buildings themselves, is the different roles that exist in those places. Like, I think you would struggle to find a female musician who hasn't been talked down to and patronised by a male sound engineer because they either assume she doesn't know what she's talking about or they don't like taking instructions from a woman. And again, to come back to that point about education and young men, I think that it's like women are vastly underrepresented in sound technology and live music production, and more needs to be done to make those careers seem both available and enjoyable to them. And I think you'll find across the country, excuse me, I'm not sure if every venue and pub has to do this, but it certainly seems very widespread now. You'll see the sort of Ask for Angela thing, and it seems as though many staff in places are trained in looking out for the well-being of the clientele who are at the venues. But I feel like venues and bars and anywhere that's putting on live music also needs to have a similar code of conduct for anybody to report wrongdoing among any of the personnel putting on the gig, whether it's the sound person or a security person, because I think that's where a lot of discouragement happens. And I'm not saying that necessarily leads to lower representation on bills, but I think it would definitely put some people off doing it again. I also wanted to talk about one really positive example, because I think that there is the possibility for artists to make change on their own terms and for that to have a sort of top-down impact. In 2018, I did a feature on the musicians Fever Ray, who is a Swedish non-binary performer. Their real name is Karen Dreyer Anderson, and they used to be in the band The Knife. And I was asked to write a piece about the radical culture on their tour, which employed 9 women or non-binary people and 4 men. Even the truck driver was a woman. And the performers and the technical staff I spoke to talked about how comfortable and free they felt, how much kindness and confidence there was on tour, how they felt they could take up more space in the room. They held discussion sessions every day for anybody to air issues or any discomfort, and they also prioritised care and well-being for everybody on the tour. And the effect was revelatory, and it didn't really seem as though it had taken all that much to create an environment where everybody felt safe and liberated to do their best work and express themselves without restriction. And I think that, it's a model that a lot of people could adopt quite easily.
That's very interesting. Thank you. Sorry, Dr. Beaumont, you wanted to...
Oh, no, I'm sorry to interrupt.
No.
There's so much in this. I can give a million examples that are just coming in my head. I agree, Laura, if you can do things in your own terms. We've had artists call Black Lives in Music and say, I just need to revamp my entire team. I just want women. And if they can be black, that's great. Because of the way they were treated by their current team, their roadies. This is the main artists. And these are artists of renown, by the way. If I was to say who it was, you'll be mind blown. But I do want to say, in regards to representation and why, there are a lot of women that do feel unsafe in the live music industry. And, the music industry is made of 72% of freelancers. Within them freelancers, 13.6% of those freelancers are women. Just 13%. So the gender imbalance can create an environment where we're seeing women workers inappropriately touch propositions on a regular basis, sexually assaulted. And unfortunately, freelancers don't receive the same education about bullying and harassment as employees. No. So they're not subject to the same employment laws. And it's very hard to tackle abuse as a freelancer, especially if the perpetrators are also freelancers. I'm sure the MU will speak about it, but 40% of women under 40 have been sexually harassed at a live music event. 40%.
40.
95% of incidences go unreported as well. But I do want to, like Laura, speak about some positives that are happening in the live music industry. Again, we work with 110 partners. One of the partners that we work with loads of festivals, but one of the festivals that we work with, are working intentionally to ensure that there are more women represented behind the stage, in production, in the technical aspect of creating a festival. We have Live, who are the umbrella body for the live music industry. And as I said earlier on, they've taken the recommendations from this report and implemented it in the WEC report and implemented it within their organisations. So they're committed to eradicating misogyny in the live music industry. They have the subcommittee. They're committed to collectively benchmarking female representatives at CEO, chair level across the entire live music industry. They have educational awareness training and gender equality and sexual harassment training. And then you've got the Royal Albert Hall, where you're talking about representation on the stage. They're the first music industry organisation to pay into CISA. They have EDI champions across the entire workforce, and they're working in a positive direction and going in regards to policies, and we work very closely with them. What we do need is a cultural change in the music industry. Just like Laura, I wish I had that question in regards to Me Too. That was a movement. a movement, it moves, it goes. You know, we will need cultural change, and the only way that can happen is if people are educated, and if, like Lucy said, there's consequence to their action. And the only recommendation that I see that brings true consequence to the actions of bullying, harassment, is seeing CISA be sustained and being invested into. And I'll say, there's loads of stuff I wanted to say and I didn't get to say. The music industry, I've heard from the top, I'm going to end here, I've heard from the top of the music, I'm talking the top, I can mention names, the top of the music industry. They've told me categorically the only thing that they're afraid of is government. The only thing that will allow them to move to change is government. All the work that we're doing at Black Lives in Music is nice. They'll work with us, they may even fund us. But the only thing that's going to make them change is if it comes from government. And we need government to get involved. There are, I said it earlier on, there are thousands and thousands of voices. We don't need any more reports. We need the report to be actioned and enacted, and then we need government to help us set up a third-party organisation to make change in the music industry, and CISA is that. And I'll just end on that.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you. I just want to say thank you very much to all of our panellists today. That has been really enlightening, but also really humbling in the personal experiences shared as well. So thank you very, very much. And I am going to bring on the next panel now. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
The second panel of our Misogyny in Music session, and we have Deborah Annett, Chief Executive of the Independent Society of Musicians, Jen Smith, Chief Executive Officer at Creative Industries Independent Standards Authority, and Naomi Paul, General Secretary of the Musicians Union. Welcome, and I imagine that you would have been able to reflect and probably rehear some of the things that you already know from the first panel, and we went into some great depth there, and I'm really hoping that we'll be able to do so in the next session as well. I'm going to hand over to Charisse first. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. I think my first question is for you, Jen. Could you briefly update the committee on where CISA is in terms of its development and launch?
Yes, of course. Before I do so, I'd just like to thank the previous witnesses for their powerful testimony, which of course emphasised the urgent need for an independent body that can provide a safe, confidential space to give impartial, confidential advice to the many harms that are current and occurring in the music sector. I'm delighted to be back to update the committee. I cannot underestimate the significance of revisiting this landmark report, which continues to play an important role in our ongoing conversations with the sector. I'm pleased to report, and you'll have heard from Dr. Charisse Beaumont, there is significant support for CISA within the music sector in the main. However, that goodwill must and needs to be translated into sustainable financial commitment. The need for CISA is evident. This is demonstrated not just in individuals that are coming to us desperately in need of help and support, but also from smaller employers who are challenged as they grapple with these difficult issues, that are looking for independent, impartial support and guidance. And I think now we've reached this tipping point where there is irreversible insight that despite all best efforts, there is a persistent problem with behaviours in the music industry, and CISA has a significant role to play in addressing that. Specifically, since we last met, we have laid very strong foundations of governance for the organisation. We have recruited a wise and engaged board, and we are ably chaired by Baroness Helena Kennedy. We've expanded the team with relevant expertise. In response to recommendation 129, we've established a cross-industry roundtable on progressing licensing, accreditation and training for key roles with safeguarding responsibilities. Crucially, we have applied to the Department of Business of Trade to become a prescribed person, and what this means is that when CISA is operational, we will be able to advise people and support people who have signed a non-disclosure agreement without them fearing repercussions. In the coming weeks, we will publish further details on our operational blueprint. We are formally engaging with those who we anticipate coming to CISA in the final stages of design of our processes, putting at the heart of how they will be served and how they can ensure that we are a safe, confidential place to hear their concerns. And we're at the beginning stages of designing our reporting system. That said, the fundamental problem remains of sustainable funding. CISA will not be built on warm wishes and one-year commitments. So even where we are now, we remain 6, most likely 9 months away from being operational with a small advice team, and that is contingent on funding commitments being immediately met and honoured. So that is the challenge that we face, where we require your assistance. Certainly, I can update you on standards. Yesterday we closed our consultation on CISA standards. We had over 700 people engage with that consultation, with a significant proportion from the music sector. So it presents a significant milestone for the creative industries as a whole, a unifying set of standards which we will socialise and embed widely, so there is no excuse. You cannot say that you did not know that was not appropriate behaviour. In tandem, we've done some international work with global industry. We've spoken to 20 territories about the potential for an international standards framework, and we'll publish that research in due course. And we continue to liaise closely with DCMS because, we know we have a role to play in the industrial strategy. You cannot grow the creative industries effectively without protecting the workforce, and we have a fundamental role in the prevention of violence against women and girls, which has been a constant theme when CISA has spoken to colleagues across the UK, in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland too. So that represents the majority of our progress. So yes, we have not stood still. Yep. That said, sustainable funding, protected funding mechanism for CISA is crucial.
Thank you, and thank you so much for making that very clear. I think that's really useful and really important. Has anyone got in touch with you already wanting to make use of CISA's upcoming services?
Yes.
Yeah.
People are desperate.
Yeah.
This is an urgent gap in provision. There is a fundamental gap in provision. Yes, there are lots of places you can go, but there is no front door service that joins the dots. People fall through those gaps. They're also concerned, again, as the testimony that you heard previously, about repercussions, about the genuine safety and confidentiality of what they will bring to us. So yes, we are giving limited advice. I can reassure the committee that we have professional expertise in the team to do that to a high standard. But again, it's not just individuals coming to us, it's small businesses, it's SMEs saying we don't know what to do. We have a code of conduct, we have no investigations procedure. What are the steps that we should take as a responsible employer? So the gap is evident, the need is evident, the urgency is evident, but we need your help to ensure that CISA can be operational as quickly as possible.
Brilliant, thank you.
Just before you continue, I'm just going to ask Christine as Vice Chair just to sit in just while I nip out quickly, and I'll be back as soon as possible.
I need to move.
Thank you very much. Yes, thank you.
Okay. Sorry. Thank you. Carry on.
My next question is, are you able to give a sense of, and I think you've kind of touched on it there, what your initial workload might look like, given that CISA's already committed to helping people with historical cases?
So this comes down to the sequencing of pacing of CISA, which we will put in the public domain in the coming weeks. You know, in the first instance, setting standards is absolutely right, to socialise those, to enable the industry to become cognizant of what they are, embedding those, launching those next month, again with a real appetite and a good response to get behind those standards as a consistent barometer for behaviours. But, you know, in terms of analysing volumes, it is a challenge for us because there is so much fear. Whilst people have come forward, we just don't know the scale, what might come out, which is why secure, stable, sustainable funding is absolutely key. And, we need to ensure that we report first. So we bring in a small advice team and a reporting portal so we can do some analysis about what the future 3 to 5 year growth of CISA will be.
Brilliant, thank you. And how willing has the industry been to commit funding to CISA?
So, there is a coalition of the willing. You heard some of them. The trade body Live, for example, the Royal Albert Hall, English National Opera, many more, Black Lives in Music, so many good, responsible leaders that want to see this done, that recognise instinctively that it's an inevitable reality that this needs to happen. It's just a question of how long it takes. But however, there are others, and particularly alarmingly in the live sector, that have not committed funding. And I will write to the committee in full when our funding round is concluded. I think you might also like to see the wider context of screen and theatre as well. But I want to show you in terms of, one of the challenges we have on funding is that people are trying to set conditions on our operational scope. So, for example, we will fund you, but only if you only do training. And obviously, as an independent body, we cannot accept conditions on our funding. So it's a new relationship that we're building with industry to understand that an independent body is different. And in terms of scoping CISA in the first instance, this was an agreed principle. We all sat down and agreed with representatives from the BPI and others that the agreed tariff model would be 0.1%, and that would be a 2-year tie-in commitment. So, this was agreed with the sector, and yet it's proving longer than we thought for people to commit to it. Hence, we are exploring alternative models.
Thank you. And are there any major organisations that have not provided the level of funding commitment that you've sought?
I will write to you in full.
Thank you. That's great. Thank you very much. My sort of final questions, are there any legislative impediments to CISA's work, for example, around data protection?
I spoke to this in my previous evidence. We've identified mitigations to potential legal issues. As we said, we've made progress in terms of supporting those people who have signed NDAs by applying to be a prescribed person in relation to Section 43F of the Employment Rights Act. So that is in train. We've also raised some of these issues with DCMS about GDPR. As we are building CISA very responsibly, very meticulously, very diligently, one of the first things that I did was to register us with the ICO. and to make it known that we are, dealing with data with a legitimate aim to prevent harm. So we've raised what we consider could be legal challenges for CISA with DCMS, and those conversations are ongoing, but we're aware of potential mitigations that would help us to act independently with the full scope of operational ability that we require to do this work to the right standard.
Brilliant. And what commitments has the government made to addressing some of those sort of legal impediments?
So we are in conversation with that. It's a very live dialogue at the moment. We've very recently spoken to DCMS. Obviously, since I updated this committee, there has been a change of government. I have met with the Secretary of State twice on these matters. It's evident to me how seriously she takes care of the workforce in the creative industries incredibly seriously. So therefore those conversations are ongoing.
Yeah, brilliant. And my final question, I think you've already alluded to this, but is a statutory funding model required if CISA is to be sustainable?
So we are looking at a range of alternative models. I think it would be a great shame in the face of undeniable evidence of need and undeniable evidence of harms if collectively, voluntarily, the industry cannot show leadership on this agenda to keep the workforce safe. We are only asking for 0.1% of UK turnover. However, we watch with interest what has recently been addressed in the gambling sector, where there is a mandated levy, albeit in pursuit of the prevention of harm to consumers. That said, the principle is the same. There is a mandated levy in order to prevent harm. But I think in addressing, this point with the committee and writing to you in terms of looking at where we get to with funding, we certainly would visit all options because this is absolutely essential.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Charisse. Christine, and thank you for sitting in the chair. Thank you.
Thank you. I wonder if we could ask Deborah, first of all, what the latest key data on the prevalence of discrimination and sexual harassment in the music sector tells you, and are there any signs of the situation improving?
Thank you very much for the invitation to talk to you this afternoon. I really appreciate the opportunity. Just before I start, I'm actually an employment solicitor, and my specialism is discrimination law. So I come at this very much in the context of statute and what needs to happen in terms of legislative changes. And although there has been some indication from this new government of change in a variety of areas, they still need to go further because at the moment the freelancers are very much outside the scope of the equalities legislation and also the employment rights bill. And when you look at the language of the legislation which is being proposed, it's all about an employment model. And within my own membership of 11,000 musicians, 90% of them are self-employed. So that just demonstrates that the legislation that is being proposed is going to fall short of tackling the issues that we've got on a statutory basis. And although I absolutely welcome the efforts of CISA to promote better standards within the sector, we also need to have a better statutory framework. Otherwise, I don't feel we're going to see justice for the protected characteristics, chiefly women. So in terms of data, I don't think the situation is getting any better. As you may know, you've got Dignity 2 in front of you. That was published in 2022, a follow-up to Dignity 1 in 2018. 2022's report found that the situation was getting worse and that discrimination was increasing. When we asked our researchers what they thought was going on, they again, like Dr. Beaumont spoke about, thought it was the impact of social media. I think we also have to understand that in a freelance community, we don't have normal workplaces. We have informal settings. Very often there is no HR function whatsoever. I always give the example of a wedding band. So you've got, say, 4 people in a band touring the country. There is no HR function. They're probably friends. Something inappropriate may happen. From Dignity 1, one of the comments was, I always travel with a sleeping bag to stop sexual assault. So that is just the nature of the culture. We've got second report generated about 660 responses. And what was so frightening was how quickly they came in, really, really fast. We didn't have to go out and encourage people to respond. It was largely women responding, and they wanted to share with us what had happened in their careers. Most of them were freelance. The discrimination and sexual harassment had happened everywhere. So in stages, in sessions, in churches, in schools, on stage, you name it, every single location they had been sexually harassed. In terms of the prevalence versus freelance versus employed, it was more weighted towards freelancers, and that, of course, is because they do not have the rights that employed workers do. They're not protected under the legislation, the Equalities Act, which is something we've been calling for some time, and in particular Section 83(2)(b), which leaves deputy musicians out in the cold. Of those who reported sexual harassment, 88% of them were self-employed, which shows the problem here in terms of the freelance model. 69% did not report because of fear of victimisation. So that, again, just shows the problem. You will not report if you think you're not going to get another gig. And we have had women coming to our legal team, and we have 6 lawyers working for us. I myself, as I said, am an employment solicitor. And what we see is that when we take a sex discrimination case, and theoretically women are protected in relation to victimisation under the equalities legislation, they still end up not getting more work because they've reported, and that's the problem. And it's one of my concerns around CISA. Absolutely welcome the idea of people being able to go there, but I think there is still the risk that if people come forward, that could be at detriment to their own careers, and that's why we need a rigorous statutory framework to work within. I just want to mention one other thing, which I found deeply, deeply troubling. We worked with the Equality and Human Rights Commission following Dignity 2. They were very, very concerned about the state of the music sector, and we did discuss whether the Commission should come in and do an investigation in the music sector because it's so bad. They don't have the resources to do that, but I would really welcome them coming into the sector and making some really strong recommendations. But instead they said that they could work with us on an orchestra toolkit. So they were basically going to use the expertise that they had developed with the hospitality sector, and they felt that this might have some kind of impact in relation to culture. And we do have a problem with culture. And it's not just men harassing downwards, it's colleagues harassing across. And that's a very important thing to understand in relation to the nature of sexual harassment within our sector. Anyway, so we worked on an orchestral toolkit. We asked the Association of British Orchestra whether they would work with us, and they said yes. And the Musicians' Union said yes, and also Black Lives in Music and various other organisations. So we felt that we had really good feedback in relation to the toolkit. We then put it out to orchestras, absolutely free of charge. This will help you with the modelling of better behaviours within your orchestras. We sent it out to about 16 orchestras. We got their feedback. We did more work on the toolkit. We then went out again and asked 14 if they would trial it. Again, totally free. 5 said that they couldn't and gave various excuses, and 9 didn't come back to us at all. And only 1 came back and said they'd give it a go. So this was a toolkit that had been developed by the music sector with the insights and experience of the Commission, which the orchestras have not picked up. And we heard back informally it was because the attitudes in the orchestras were so entrenched, and that is really what the whole toolkit was about, trying to unpick some of those attitudes, that they didn't want to get involved with the toolkit. So my question, really, and I don't know how to tackle this, and I feel I should know because this is my field of expertise. How do you shift culture? And I will go back to my experience as an employment lawyer because I worked in the tribunal for many, many years and sued an awful lot of organisations. I actually think you need to sue people. You need to sue companies and you need to sue senior managers to shift culture. And that does sound tremendously aggressive, but I don't think the culture of this sector is going to shift just with CISA. I think we need a better statutory framework, and then we need to have some test cases. Thank you.
Naomi, was there anything you wanted to add to that?
Thank you. Yes. So Dr. Beaumont referenced a musician census that we ran along with Help Musicians, and we had 6,000 respondents to that, which was fantastic because we've been looking for a data set so that we could really understand the careers of musicians today. And we actually ran a smaller version of that survey in 2013, and it showed the average earnings for musicians then were £20,000, and they're still earning just £20,000 on average. And women musicians are earning less than male musicians. The stat I think that was most shocking to me is that of the musicians earning over $70,000 a year, only 19% of those were women. So it shows that women are facing many barriers to having successful careers in music, and they are facing discrimination. More women face age discrimination. 30% of women reported that, whereas only 21% of men did. 87% of women who responded had experienced or witnessed discrimination, as opposed to 65% of men. And as you'd expect, childcare falls much more heavily on women, even though a lot of men in music, because of the hours, actually might look after their children during the day or pick them up from school. It doesn't present a career barrier to men in the same way that it does to women. So 29% said that family commitments were a barrier, whereas only 18% of men said that. And obviously childcare is costly, and it was referenced in the previous panel that there just isn't the support there. So if I could just give an example of an orchestral musician who's a freelancer. I was talking to a woman last week who said that she was doing a gig. It was £100 for the concert. It was 2 hours for her to travel there by car, 2 hours to travel home. She couldn't stay overnight because she couldn't afford the accommodation. And I think that if I could put another piece of the jigsaw puzzle forward, it's that there are a lot of financial problems in the music industry. Obviously women and men working in music can be quite low earning, and I think that does mean that there's quite a power imbalance in the working relationships. As we've heard, freelancers are desperate to maintain their careers and to earn, and they don't always have a choice actually to step away from a gig. Even if there's a perpetrator in that environment, they're in a position where they can't pay their mortgage and they can't pay their bills, and they still have to go and do the gig regardless. Also, safety concerns then take a back seat because you're not given sufficient expenses to go and do the gig in order to book the accommodation or to get home safely or to use a taxi instead of walking home, for example. So there's many, many problems. And the imbalance of power is a big one. We've also heard about informal working environments. Bad contracts are a problem as well. We've heard about NDAs, but also people are often trapped into really unpleasant deals that go on for very long periods of time, and they find it very hard to extricate themselves from those deals, even if something's gone wrong in a working relationship or if they've been a survivor of abuse. We've heard about the prevalence of alcohol and drugs in environments and issues around touring as well. If you're on a tour bus or if you're in a hotel room after a gig, there's a lot of environments where it's unpoliced. And if there is an issue that's reported, sometimes the employer or engager won't take responsibility because it happened out of hours or it happened. We had one case where there was an incident of abuse on tour, and the woman who'd experienced the abuse was told that you've got to go and report it to the police in that local territory, and the employer didn't take any responsibility for it because it happened in a hotel room after a concert. It didn't actually happen on their watch, if you like. So these are the kinds of problems that we're facing. And we've been running a safe space service for musicians and anyone working in music since 2019. We've had constant reports coming in. We had quite an influx at the beginning when we opened it. There was quite a lot of reports even during COVID closures when I thought it might go quiet. But I think because online abuse was still occurring, and we're still now seeing very frequent reports. So this is not a problem that's gone away. We think CISA's crucial, and we would support what Jen said. I don't think Jen should be spending her time going around to organisations and trying to negotiate to get them to pay into CISA. I think it does need to be mandatory. If people can opt out, they will opt out. And I'd also support what Deborah said about also needing the legislative framework as well.
Thank you. I just want to, before you start, Christine, just say that there's likely to be votes soon. So what we'll do is that when the bells go, we'll suspend the session and then we'll vote and then come back. Is that all right?
Yeah.
Okay, that means we might overrun slightly. Is everyone okay with that? Good. Thank you, Christine.
So, I was only going to ask, just to follow up on that. We've previously found that 48% of those who suffered inappropriate behaviour didn't report it. There was no one to report to. So are you confident that the creation of CISA will be a game changer in that regard?
I think it definitely will be. I think that, I mentioned that we run our safe space service and we have had many, many reports, but a lot of women who report don't ever see meaningful justice, particularly if you're a freelancer and you're making a report about another freelancer. It might be historic in nature, and it's very difficult for engagers to, even if they receive a report, to deal with it if it's something that happened many years ago. Or if that project has closed and the two freelancers are no longer working together. And I think in music particularly, people will go and do one gig for an engager. So there's very, very short-term contracts. And that means that it is very difficult to find the right reporting mechanism. So I've said to Jen previously that we've been running Safe Space for a long time, but this is not proprietorial. This is not about who's, who owns a certain issue. This is an issue that affects the whole of the music industry. Yeah. I would be delighted if we could close Safe Space because there were no longer reports and there was no longer a need. And I do think CISA, as an independent body, will hopefully be trusted and be able to provide that extra level of investigation and support.
I just wondered, Deborah, you said you thought the only answer was to sue. Does that mean that you would feel that there needs to be more than CISA, or do you think CISA can be a game changer?
I am not sure, is the honest answer. And that may be just because of my background as an employment solicitor. I do believe that you have to have, at the very base, rights that you can enforce. And at the moment, if you're a freelancer, there is a lack of rights, which means you are excluded from the equalities legislation. There have been changes in relation to, and this gets very technical, but something called discrimination questionnaires, which used to be available, that were abolished by the Cameron government. We still haven't sorted out third-party harassment, and at the moment what has been drafted within the Employment Rights Bill is predicated on an employment relationship, and within music, as you've heard, it's largely a freelance relationship. So that simply will not meet the challenge. I also think that we need to absolutely tackle NDAs, and I speak as somebody who must have done about 1,000 NDAs in my lifetime, so I hold my hands up in relation to doing NDAs. But we need to come and have a look at them. If they're commercial, fine. If they're related to sex discrimination and harassment, or anything relating to protected characteristics, then I think we either scrap them or we make them time limited. And lastly, I do believe, and again this is because of my background, that we need to fund the Equality and Human Rights Commission adequately. In 2010, its budget was 53 million. It is now 17 million. And those were cuts carried out by the last government. And it makes it very difficult for them to discharge their statutory duties. So my own view is that CISA may be part of the jigsaw. I do worry about two things in relation to CISA. One is you make an approach and then you're victimised. How do we protect the individual? That's the first thing, because victimisation is ever so common. The second aspect in relation to CISA is timeframes. And again, I speak as an employment solicitor. One of the most important things in employment law is getting your claim in on time. Now, government has said that they are going to change the time frame for bringing a claim from 3 to 6 months, which is fantastic news. But sometimes, particularly in the field of maternity law, things can go very badly wrong for the woman, and they find themselves out of time to bring a case. I think it's really important that CISA is adequately signposting things like the time period for bringing a claim. I think at the moment also CISA doesn't signpost to ACAS, which is absolutely essential because so much work is done in relation to ACAS. And I think there are various other agencies that should be signposted which are not at the moment in relation to CISA. So I see CISA as a work in progress rather than there finally. I'm absolutely happy to put my 6 lawyers at the disposal of CISA to get it into a slightly more fit-for-purpose situation. We do 2,000 cases a year, and a third of those are in the employment space. And a lot of those relate to the nature of the workplace and something that has gone very badly wrong. So we're very happy to work with CISA just to absolutely tweak all the stuff to get it perfect.
Thank you. Just before you come in, Jen, Rachel's got a supplementary question on this point.
Yeah. Thank you, Deborah. I'm a lawyer myself, although not an employment specialist. Just want to follow up on something that you've highlighted, that you feel that for things to change that there needs to be more legal action or more people sued. But we've already touched on the fact that a lot of this space is freelancers and other freelancers. How do you think those legal actions should take place to have effect? Because obviously private civil legal action is hugely expensive.
No.
Can we try and keep answers as short as possible? Because we've got quite a few questions to go through, but thank you. That would be good.
That's why we're calling on the government to act in relation to the last report from the Misogyny in Music Committee. And I also think we need to amend the equalities legislation so it absolutely is clear that it covers freelancers. So you're absolutely right. At the moment, we do not have the tools. That's why this is, to my mind, it's three-pronged. One, we have to have the statutory framework, which is strengthening the legislation, which at the moment has the loophole for freelancers. Two, it's cultural change. And you heard about the orchestras not wanting to do the toolkit. And three, it's CISA. So there are 3 different things here, but they've all got to work together. And at the moment, unfortunately, we haven't seen government going as far as we need them to go.
Thank you.
I'm conscious that we may get called any second, so I just wondered, Naomi, if I could ask, what have you found to be the most effective ways of getting the industry to care about preventing and holding perpetrators of misogynistic behaviour to account?
Well, I think that it's a subject matter that we've talked about a lot within the industry, but I think the meaningful change hasn't yet come. I think that if I can use an example of where we have made some change in the orchestral sector is around inclusive recruitment. And the way we've done it is through meaningful partnerships. So we've partnered with Black Lives in Music and the ABO. And what we've done is consulted orchestras and consulted individual musicians as well to try and change some very entrenched recruitment practices that have tended to mean that we have certain musicians are underrepresented in the workforce in orchestras, and in order to see the diversity that we want to see, we have to change the recruitment practices. So the way we've done that is to have a sort of pincer movement, if you like. The employers working very closely with the union, making sure that musicians are involved. We've rolled out a training programme that's involved the musicians as well as the employers, and we've worked with Black Lives in Music as well to get it right. And that has had quite a lot of kind of positive engagement, and we're beginning to see that change, and they are adopting it, even though some of the recommendations were quite unpopular at first. So I think the key thing is to collaborate and make sure that people are on board, consulted and involved from the beginning. I think that, you know, I referenced the financial issues that the sector faces. I think there are problems like at the grassroots end and in orchestras where they're not well funded enough to do what they want to do, and unfortunately initiatives around diversity and inclusion tend to drop off the agenda when organisations are in survival mode.
Order, we're just going to have to Going to resume the session. We are quorum while the vote takes place, and the other members will join us after they have voted. Deborah, I just had a quick question about this idea of suing. As Naomi had said, there's already this massive imbalance in terms of power, but also in terms of pay.
Yeah.
Predominantly, the women will be lower paid, as we'd heard from the previous panel, especially if they're black women. Compared to their white counterparts, but compared to the men, compared to the powerful men within the industry. How realistic do you think it is that we would ever see somebody that is, I would say, exploited by the industry, actually being able to sue those that are in power and responsible for it, given the cost and the power imbalance there?
So just going back to the ISM, we've got 6 lawyers, and we work on a totally cost-free basis for our members. So we are taking cases all the time in various different jurisdictions. We've even taken a case all the way to the Supreme Court. It doesn't cost our members a penny, and that's really important. It's one of the primary reasons we were set up in 1882. So I'm not saying that there is access to justice as much as I would like to see. What I'm saying is you have to have a framework of rights in order for people to behave. And that sounds really strange, but it's actually true. You have to have a framework, a statutory framework, in order to reinforce the point that there are some things that you cannot do in the workplace.
I entirely agree with you up to a point.
Mm-hmm.
If we just take, for example, rape. It's illegal to rape. The prosecution rates are so low, 98% of reported rapes go completely unpunished. These laws and protections for workers are only good if they can be enforced, which is why I'm asking around the reality of how these could be enforced, given the power imbalances that they are within the music industry.
I think just having a framework is a deterrent to start off with. It also gives legal teams like my own something to work with when they are talking to an employer or a contractor or a record label or a promoter or a producer. And that is really important, that you've got something to back up what you want to communicate. Culture is not sufficient. Trying to change culture is not sufficient. It's very difficult. And this sector hasn't been good at doing it. I'm just going to give another example from 2023. And this is not to do with sex discrimination. It's to do with a conductor, and this was in the public domain, who punched a tenor in front of everybody. And eventually he was moved on from his orchestra. But he set up a new orchestra and then competed head-to-head with his previous employer. So there was no deterrence there in relation to the individual. Now, I'm not saying that a statutory framework would stop a conductor punching a tenor on stage, but that does demonstrate some of the challenges we have with behaviour. So I think statutory framework, along with the work of CISA, along with the work that we and the MU does, and also tackling the behaviours that tend to get put in train in music colleges, which is where this culture is formulated. It is a multifaceted, complex set of things that we need to address.
Okay, thank you. I personally find it really hard to understand why it's complicated to not abuse your position of power or to punch somebody on stage, personally. But Jen, and then I'll come to Naomi.
I just may, for the record, just add a few points that I think will be helpful for the committee. In the first instance, it's important to reinforce that CISA is an absolutely safe and confidential place. So any action that is taken by CISA is driven by the user. So nobody's identity would ever be compromised in coming to us. It is absolutely safe and confidential. In respect of time limits, we absolutely support going from 3 to 6 months in terms of employment tribunals. We've spoken extensively with ACAS, who've been incredibly helpful to us in our development. And of course, we will signpost to them as an array of other organisations once we are open for business. The point being, we're not yet operational because of the funding issue that I have raised. But I think in terms of being a front door service, we would actually help people access their rights quicker, so they could get to an employment tribunal more quickly by CISA's presence. There are a lot of things out there, but people fall through gaps, which is why we need to be that presence, that front door, to refer people accordingly to where is the most appropriate place. And I think, thank you for your kind offer of employment law support, but we are taking independent employment law counsel at KC level.
Thank you. Naomi, just quickly, and then I'm going to come to Charisse.
I just wanted to say that on that particular issue of the conductor who's high profile, I think that is a cultural issue, because unfortunately the orchestral world has decided that it's okay for him to carry on working and people will still work for him internationally because of his profile. And I think that there's been a couple of articles published in the press since which made me so angry, basically saying that in order to maintain artistic excellence, it's okay to accept these kinds of levels of behaviour. And we have to say, as an industry, that it's not okay. So that involves everybody standing together. And I do think CISA's role will be really important in the culture change piece.
Thank you. Charisse. Charisse. Yeah.
Thank you, Chair. My question is for Naomi. To what extent do you think some venues are ill-prepared to respond to sexual misconduct because of a lack of funding versus simply being apathetic?
I think we talked about the Seat at the Table report that's produced by Women in Control, which showed that there are more women now in positions of on boards and also kind of senior management level in the industry. But I do think that we've probably looked more at trade bodies. I'd be really interested to see a data set looking at who actually books musicians, because who's making the choices about who gets to be on stage. And I think that would be, I think if there's an apathy, then that is possibly because there's less diversity and people making those kind of choices. And I think it's really important that we face up to that as an industry and try and tackle it. If we have more women booking musicians, we're going to see more women on stage. You know, we've actually seen direct discrimination cases where people have said we don't want a female-fronted band because audiences aren't interested, which is just absolutely outrageous. So, you know, I think that is a really important element. Could you just repeat the rest of the question? So I could...
Yeah, it's just to what extent are some venues ill-prepared to respond to sexual misconduct because of a lack of funding versus simply being apathetic?
Thank you. Yeah, so I do think that the apathy is real, but I also think that when we talk to small organisations, they are ill-equipped and they do say that their finances are the big problem. So I think if they had the money in order to put certain measures in place, then that would be an enormous help. I think that if, like I said earlier, I think if you're in survival mode, so if you look at grassroots music venues, they're closing all over the place. It's not going to be their top priority to try and fix some of these kind of cultural problems. What they're looking at is how do they keep open, how can they try and get as much money behind the bar as possible, how can they pay their business rates. So that's the reality of the kind of landscape.
Thank you. Just on that, before I hand over to Alex, one of the areas that were first panel suggested as being a problem was studios. Has been a problematic space. UK Music had set out a code of conduct, the Safer Studios initiative. Do you think that will be effective in addressing poor behaviour in these premises, or do you need to see tighter rules and regulations and guidelines? Naomi or Jen?
Well, I think that there are problems across the whole of music. As we've said, I don't think it's specific to studios. I think there's the really big studios, and for sure there's a kind of sometimes a bit of a cultural issue there, I think, in the musicians who are booked and the kind of culture that can occur, and, you know, again, making sure there's clear reporting mechanisms. But at the very small end, you can see that, you know, these are closed spaces. I thought it was quite an interesting suggestion earlier about recording studio sessions to make sure that any inappropriate behaviour is captured. So I think, again, it's probably harder at the smaller level where they've got less resources than at the kind of big studio end where they've probably got more policies and procedures in place and there's just more people around in general. But I have had issues reported to me from that world.
If I may add, Chair, I think the Music Producers Guild that represents studio spaces have come to us, are supportive of CISA, recognise our role in helping them deal with this challenge. You know, we have a fundamentally important role to play in prevention. That is what will change culture. So, you know, we acknowledge that these are unsafe spaces and, you know, there is a recognition particularly about how studios address this. So that's one of the practical interventions to drive up change that we will take working with partners in the sector.
You, Deborah, did you have anything to add on that one?
Well, again, going back to the Dignity 2 report, we found that there was discrimination and sexual harassment absolutely everywhere, so it's not just within studios. So I'm just going to quote from that report: on stage, in rehearsals, on tour buses, teaching in schools, at networking events, during performances, unwanted social media messages, and within the orchestral space. So there was absolutely nowhere where women was safe. So again, that comes back to this being a cultural issue.
Thank you. Christine, I'm going to come to you now about licensing managers. Thank you.
Yeah, sorry, I lost my place slightly when I ran out. Yes. I wonder if we can ask you, the previous committee recommended that CISA help to develop a mandatory accreditation programme for managers in music. How has this progressed since the report's publication?
Yes, it has. We've worked with the Music Managers Forum, again, another organisation that are proactively supporting CISA. What we did is actually convened a cross-industry roundtable across the creative industries. So we also had representatives from fashion there, for example, from screen, looking at key roles that have safeguarding responsibilities and talking to those communities about what was the most appropriate route. Was it licensing? Was it accreditation? Was it additional training? And so that work continues. But again, it's another positive, preventative asset that CISA will bring in terms of assurance of people in key roles with responsibilities, that they understand their safeguarding responsibilities and that there is independent oversight of that in terms of CISA working with those, providing the necessary oversight around accreditation, licensing and so on. So there has been progress. That roundtable has met now 3 times and it will be one of the pieces of work that we will update the committee on as we move forward.
Thank you.
Thank you. Rachel, on the Equality Act and employment law, please.
Thank you. Deborah, the ISM and others have argued for the Equality Act to be amended to better protect freelancers. What changes would you like to see and why?
I'm going to start off with the Equality Act as it stands. I think one of the issues we've got here is this fuzzy area around the term worker. What is a worker? And I don't think, just in legal terms, there's a lot of clarity around that, and whether it extends as far as the concept of being a freelancer. And that is particularly demonstrated around a particular section of the Equalities Act, Section 83, where it's not entirely clear, and we have taken a barrister's opinion on this, on whether that goes as far as protecting freelancers, and that is around discrimination. So I would like to see this government make it very clear that the equalities legislation extends across to freelancers. I also think that there is an unfortunate way of looking at rights within this current government, that it's all about employment law. And because so many of our workers are actually freelance, we need the Employment Rights Bill to go further and make it very clear that in its protections, it is also protecting freelancers. And that does not mean that we want people to be pushed into being self-employed. It's simply a recognition of how our sector actually works. And we want parity with the rights that are accorded to people who are employed. And we even see this, and we did hear mention of this, in relation to something called the maternity pay allowance. And the way it is structured actually makes it much less fair if you are a self-employed woman who is pregnant and then gives birth, rather than an employed woman, you actually suffer an impediment by comparison to an employed woman. If an employed woman works on a self-employed basis and is paid, she does not suffer any detriment to her maternity pay. If a self-employed woman does that, she will suffer an impediment to her maternity allowance. I cannot see the justification for that, and I would like to see the government look at the maternity pay allowance and take away that inbuilt iniquity that sits within it. Given how much of our workforce is freelance, we really do need maternity pay allowances to actually apply equitably to this female workforce. And we can give you chapter and verse on this. And this is an issue that has been going on for quite some time with successive governments. We've talked about NDAs, and I think that's something that needs to happen. We need to see them scrapped or time limited. And also just coming back to third-party harassment. And then this is, at the moment, within the Employment Rights Bill, it's very much based around the employer having an obligation. Well, what if there is no employer? What if the sexual harassment is done by a member of the audience? It is possible within our particular setting. So we need the third-party harassment provisions to be broad enough to cover our sector, because third-party harassment is actually really prevalent within our sector. And again, our model just doesn't fit the way employment works within the Employment Rights Bill. So we wrote to, or rather I wrote to the Cabinet Office after I had a meeting with them in October of last year and said, these are the things that we need you to take on board. And they all came out of Dignity 2. So far, we haven't heard anything positive back. I chased them yesterday, and they confirmed that no action as yet has happened. So I would invite this committee to perhaps follow up in relation to these provisions, which would be of real value to our sector. And as I said, I do think the statutory framework is part of tackling some of the challenges that we have within the music sector.
Thank you. I think we've already covered the idea of introducing a ban on NDAs. Naomi, do you think there could be any negative consequences for women in music that have suffered abuse if NDAs were made illegal?
I don't believe so. I know that some people argue that there should be a choice for the survivor to ask for them, but what worries me is how coercive the industry is where there's a power imbalance. So in my experience, it's much more likely that an NDA would be used to silence the survivor rather than the survivor looking to the NDA for protection. So for me, I think it would be, these measures would be very sensible and helpful.
Okay. And then to what extent do you think that enacting the ban could contribute to a cultural shift in the industry where women could feel safe enough to report abuse? I'll ask you first, Naomi, but I think then I'd welcome your views too.
I think we need to try and create a safe culture of reporting, and I think that there's safety in numbers if people start to speak out. Unfortunately, women are often prevented from speaking out because they're afraid of, again, if there's a financial imbalance, they're afraid of being pursued for defamation. But I think it's really important that they're not proactively silenced, and sometimes they contact us and say, I can't do anything about this because I'm under an NDA. So that shouldn't be the case.
Thank you. Jen.
I think this would be absolute decisive leadership on behalf of the government taking forward a ban of the misuse of NDAs that are often used as an extension of victimisation. And I think it is an immediate opportunity to make lasting and meaningful change, which would prevent many future harms in the music industry and beyond. I think it's really important that this work is not mischaracterised in terms of what is being asked for. So should somebody who requests privacy in the face of abuse ask for that, that is accommodated for in the amendment. I think, it's very important, though, that the misuse of NDAs is banned, and it will make a seismic, immediate impact.
Thank you. And Deborah?
I would agree with that. At the moment, there is very little for a perpetrator to fear within the music sector. And so you can see the perpetrator continuing with their inappropriate behaviours again and again and again. If we get rid of NDAs, I think that type of behaviour will be much more difficult to continue. And I totally agree with Jen and Naomi. This would be a game changer for the music sector.
Thank you.
Thank you. Charisse, had a follow-up.
Thank you. I just have one final question, really. So the last committee published their report a year ago. I just want to know, has anything changed, either positive or negative, since then in the industry's treatment of women? And also, are there any additional challenges that we need to be aware of when we sort of take on the next stage of this?
I think one positive change has been a change in government, if I may say that. In relation to that last report, I know that the chair of this committee tried really hard to get the DCMS to take on board the recommendations, and every single recommendation was rejected. I think with a new government in place, this is an opportunity to restate those recommendations, and given that we have an employment rights bill out there, given that protected characteristics are being looked at, and the equalities legislation, I think this is such an opportunity for this committee to make a real impact in relation to changing the way that culture and safety operates at the moment within the music sector.
Naomi? I think we haven't seen major change in the industry. I think there's pockets of change. So an example I wanted to give, Live was referenced, which is a quite new trade body for the live music industry. And the CEO, who is a man, stood up on stage at the Live Awards and talked about women's menstrual health on tour. And I was like, yes, this is fantastic. You know, we need more male allies like that in positions of power who are willing to talk about issues that affect women. So there's pockets of like really positive change. But I think that, you know, we need CISA to be able to get up and running. That is going to require a sustainable funding model that they don't have at present. And it shouldn't be voluntary in my view. A couple of other things I wanted to mention. Childcare could be tax deductible for the self-employed so that women can actually see that as it recognised as a cost of doing their jobs. Mention the maternity allowance that needs to be increased and the option to do more work, because if you're a gigging freelancer, you need to do the odd gig in order to just keep your hand in. I think the recommendations in the previous report were so good, we'd just love to see them implemented. And I know Labour's already made promises about looking into rights for the self-employed, but I know that it's waiting on the employment rights bill kind of happening first. So we really want to be involved in that piece of work and to look into rights for the self-employed in more detail.
Yeah, thank you. Yep, Jen.
I would just say, you know, the coalition of the willing in terms of those leaders showing the dynamic leadership and the collective courage required to drive forward CISA is growing. You know, the glaring gap in impartial, independent, safe, confidential advice remains evident, and the need, you know, 91% of people that we surveyed in a SNAP survey of 800 creatives said they absolutely need CISA, and 84% of them said that they would use it. So there's absolute urgency for this to be, you know, for us to be open for business, and we require your help and your support and your continued support in doing so.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. I think that that's a good place to end for today. I would invite, I know that this has been a squeezed session, if there is anything else that any of you think that we should know and you haven't had the opportunity to be able to say it, please do write in and follow up with written evidence. It would always be gratefully received. So thank you very much. That brings today's proceedings to a close.